The Concord of the Bright Meridian did not build ships to hide. It built them to be seen. That was the first thing the human observer learned aboard the flagship Orolith, and it was the thing the Concord repeated most often, as if the repetition itself were a kind of prayer. A vessel that could not be seen was a coward's vessel. A weapon that struck from concealment was a thief's weapon. Light, the Concord taught, was truth, and truth was the only honorable ground on which a war could be decided. Their warships blazed across the dark like moving cities, hulls plated in mirror alloy that threw back the glare of distant suns, running lights strung along their spines in patterns older than most human civilizations. When the Concord came to a system, everyone knew. That was the point. Commander Elish Varro was 26 years old, and she had spent the last 19 hours pretending to be impressed. She stood on the observation gallery of the Orolith with her hands folded behind her back, watching the great ship's crew move through their duties with the unhurried confidence of a people who had never, in 4,000 years of recorded history, lost a war they intended to win. Around her the gallery curved in a long transparent arc, and beyond it hung the Meridian shipyards, a lattice of docks and gantries and half-finished dreadnoughts, all of it lit from within like the world's most expensive chandelier. It was, Elish had to admit, beautiful. It was also, by every metric her own species had learned in the hard schools of the last 2 centuries, insane. "You are quiet, human," said the officer beside her. His name was Submarshal Tavan Rel, and he was tall even by the standards of his kind. The Concord ran to height, long limbs and long faces and skin the color of old ivory, eyes set wide and faceted like a predator that hunted in bright places. He wore the white and gold of the flag rank, and he wore it the way a man wears a title he has never once had to defend. When he looked at Elish, he looked down, and not only because of the height. "I'm observing, Submarshal," Elish said. "That's what an observer does." "Observe, then." Tavan gestured at the yards with one long hand, and there was pride in the gesture, and something under the pride that she had learned to recognize in the 19 hours since her shuttle had docked. Contempt worn smooth by generations, so habitual it no longer felt like an emotion at all. It felt like fact. The Vashani class, 900 meters at the keel, 48 primary emitters. When she fires her main lance, the discharge is visible from 3 systems away. Do you understand what that means, Commander? Tell me. It means that when we come, our enemies have days to consider their choices, days to surrender. We do not sneak up on the weak and cut their throats in the dark. We arrive in glory and we give them the dignity of seeing what will end them. He turned those wide-faceted eyes on her. This is why the galaxy tolerates us. We are terrible, but we are honest. Can your people say the same? Elish said nothing. She had been briefed extensively on the Concord's philosophy of war, and she had been briefed even more extensively on the one thing she was not permitted to say aloud, no matter how the conversation turned, no matter how badly she wanted to. So she looked out at the shining yards and she let the silence do its work, and after a moment Tavan Rel smiled, taking the silence for defeat. "I have seen your vessels," he said more gently now, the way one might gentle atone for a child or an animal. "Before your delegation arrived, I reviewed the scans from the Talat frontier, the ships your species brought to the border." He let a small laugh escape, dry and papery. "Forgive me, Commander, I do not mean to wound, but they are, how does your own language put it?" "They are ugly." "They are," Elish agreed. That surprised him. He had expected argument. "You concede it." "I've seen them too, Submarshal. They're gray. They don't reflect. Half the hull is ablative foam and the other half is armor we grow instead of forge, and the whole thing looks like something a poor man welded together in a hurry." She smiled, and it was a small smile, and it did not reach her eyes. "We don't build for beauty. We stopped a long time ago." "Because you cannot afford it." "Because we learned what happens to things that shine." Tavan Rel did not understand her, and that was fine. That was, in fact, the entire arrangement. 19 hours earlier, The human delegation had arrived at the Meridian yards under a flag of parley, 3 shuttles and a diplomatic cruiser, and a great deal of formal language, and the Concord had received them with the elaborate courtesy that great powers extend to small ones they intend to absorb. The pretext was a border dispute. Along the Talat frontier, where human space brushed up against the outer marches of conquered territory, there had been incidents: a survey ship boarded, a colony convoy turned back, a mining station's charter revoked by fiat. Small things, deliberate things. The Concord was testing the fence, the way a large animal tests a fence, leaning its weight against it a little more each season to see when it would give. Humanity had sent HFY and a handful of diplomats to lean back. But that was the pretext, and HFY was not, whatever her credentials claimed, a diplomat. She was the commander of a warship, and her warship was not in the Meridian yards, and it was not on any scan the Concord had ever run. And if the plan held, if the long, patient, terrifying plan held, the sub-marshal standing beside her would learn that fact in approximately 14 hours, and he would learn it in a way he would remember for the rest of his short and suddenly reconsidered life. She kept her face still. She had gotten very good at that. The sable iris held station 4 light seconds off the Meridian yards, and nothing in the universe could see her. This was not quite true, and Alicia's crew would have been the first to say so, at length, with the particular grim humor of people whose lives depended on a technology they understood better than they trusted. The iris was not invisible. Nothing was invisible. The physics did not allow it. What the iris did was harder and stranger than invisibility. She managed her own presence in the universe. Every photon she might reflect, every whisper of heat she might shed, every gravitic ripple her mass might trace across the local metric. And she managed it actively, constantly, with a discipline so total that maintaining it was the single most exhausting duty a human crew could perform. Her hull did not reflect light. It ate light and re-emitted the exact spectrum of the empty space behind her, so that a scanner sweeping her position saw only the stars she stood in front of, subtly redrawn. Her reactors did not vent heat into space. They pumped it inward, into vast heat sinks in her belly, and the crew lived with the slow accumulation of that heat, the way sailors of an older age had lived with the slow accumulation of foul air in a submerged hull, measuring it, dreading it, knowing that eventually the ship would have to surface and shed her thermal debt or cook everyone inside. Her drive did not push against space in ways that could be traced. When she moved on a principle the Concord's physicists had classified, dismissed, and filed away as a theoretical dead end 400 years before. She was ugly. Alicia told the sub-marshal the truth about that. The iris was a gray wedge 400 meters long, sheathed in a matte skin that drank the running lights of her own hangar bay, studded with the strange, irregular knuckles of her emitter arrays and the drab organic swell of her grown armor. She had no windows. She had no name painted on her flank in glorious script. She had nothing that could be seen, because everything that could be seen was a way to die. And she was, at this moment, the most dangerous single object within 100 light years, and the entire Concord of the Bright Meridian did not know she existed. On the Iris's bridge, a low, dim, close space, lit in the deep red that human eyes had learned to work by when they could not afford to spill a single lumen, Lieutenant Commander Daishi Okonkwo watched the Meridian yards bloom across his displays and thought, not for the first time, that his commander had a strange definition of a reasonable plan. "Contact holding," he said quietly. On the Iris everyone spoke quietly. It had nothing to do with sound carrying through vacuum. It could not, and they all knew it could not. It was a discipline of the body that reinforced a discipline of the ship. If you whispered, you remembered to be careful. Yard traffic nominal. No active sweeps in our cone. Thermal load at 31% of tolerance. 31, repeated the woman in the command chair, and acting Captain Surabel nodded slowly. She was older than Elish. This was her ship's second, running the Iris while the commander walked the enemy's flagship in the guise of a diplomat, and she carried the weight of a plan she had argued against and then, once overruled, executed flawlessly. That was the human way, or the way of the fleet at least. Argue in the planning room, obey in the dark. We've got a long wait yet. Rotate the thermal watch. I don't want anyone at that board more than 2 hours. It makes people stupid, and I need everyone smart. Aye, Captain. Surabel leaned back and looked at the great shining thing on her displays. The yards, the half-built dreadnoughts, the flagship Orlith at the heart of it all like a jewel in a setting. And she felt the old cold anger move in her, the anger that every human of her generation carried folded up small inside the chest, taken out only when it was useful. She was old enough to remember the rendering of Kesh. Not everyone was. It had been 30 years, and 30 years is long enough that most of the fleet knew it only as a lesson, a thing in the manuals, a reason for the way they built their ships. But Surabel had been a girl on a colony world when the ships came, and she remembered the light. That was the thing about the Concord that the manuals never quite captured, the thing that Elish had tried to explain to the submarshal and given up on. When the Concord came to render a world that had refused them, they came in glory, exactly as they promised. They lit the sky. Surabel had stood in a refugee column with her mother's hand crushing her own, and she had watched the Concord dreadnoughts hang in the high air like new suns, beautiful beyond anything she had words for, and she had watched them open their mirror-bright hulls and begin, methodically, honestly, in full view of everyone, to unmake the cities of Kesh one by one. They had given Kesh the dignity of seeing what ended it, 2 million people. She remembered the light. Humanity had learned a great deal from Kesh. It had learned that it could not win a war of glory against the Conquered, could not outbuild them, outshine them, outblaze them in the honest, bright places where the Conquered wanted to fight. It had gone away and licked its wounds and thought hard for a generation, and it had come back with a different idea about what honesty was worth. Captain, Daishi's voice still quiet. Message drone from the delegation. Squirt burst, tight beam, cold protocol. It's the commander's hand. Surabel sat up. Read it. Daishi read it, and as he read it his face changed, and Surabel watched the change and understood, before he finished, that the timeline they had planned for had just become the timeline they were going to get. She's confirmed it, Daishi said. All of it. The Orlith isn't a flagship on a courtesy tour, Captain. It's a command node. The submarshal she's babysitting, Rel, he's not an escort. He's the theater commander for the entire Talat push. He looked up. The border incidents weren't tests. They were staging. The Concord's massing behind the Meridian yards right now to hit the frontier colonies. Full rendering doctrine. 7 worlds on the target list. The commander pulled the whole plan off a data slate. A staff officer left unlocked at a reception. The bridge was very quiet, quieter even than the discipline of the ship required. 7 worlds. Elish had walked into the enemy's most defended space, unarmed, alone, and she had come back out by drone, by a whisper of light too faint to trace, with the names of 7 worlds the Conquered meant to render. And behind the yards, mustering in the honest bright glory of their doctrine, certain that no one could see them because no one had ever been able to see anything they did not choose to show, the war fleet of the Bright Meridian was assembling. They don't know we're here, Surabel said slowly. No, Captain. They don't know we can be here. They think it's impossible. 400 years of it being impossible. She stood. She was not a large woman, and in the deep red light of the bridge she did not look like much, and that was the whole point of everything humanity had become. Get me the commander's full read, every ship, every position, every timeline, and wake the department heads, quietly. A thin smile. We're going to do the thing we came to do. 14 hours is a long time to hold your face still. Elish Varro had learned the trick of it in the schools the fleet ran for people who would have to go into bright places and pretend to be small. It was not about lying, exactly. It was about becoming, for a while, the thing the enemy needed you to be, the impressed provincial, the overmatched diplomat, the young woman from a poor and ugly people who had come, cap in hand, to lean on a fence and been shown just how immovable that fence was. The Concord wanted her small, so she was small. She made herself small so completely that Sub-Marshal Tavan Rel forgot to watch her, and a man who forgets to watch you will show you everything. He showed her a great deal in those 14 hours. He showed her the muster hall, where the theater staff moved troop dispositions across a great luminous table, and though he did not mean to show her the table itself, she was steered wide of it, with courtesy. He did not think to prevent her from seeing the faces of the officers around it, and Alish had been trained to read the tension in a war staff the way a farmer reads weather. She saw men and women who believed they were 40 hours from a victory. She saw the particular loose confidence of people who have rehearsed a thing so many times that the doing of it has become a formality. He showed her the reception, where the conquered civilian grandees came to look at the human delegation, the way one looks at animals in a menagerie, and where a staff officer, young, proud, a little drunk on the wine and a great deal drunk on his own importance, set his data slate down on a side table to gesture with both hands, while he explained to a rapt audience exactly how the Talat frontier would be brought to heel. Alish had drifted near. She had made herself small, and invisible in the way that a person who is beneath notice is invisible, and she had let her fingers brush the slate for the 4 seconds her implant needed, and she had drifted away again with the operational plan for the rendering of 7 worlds copied into a crystal lattice behind her sternum. Then she had gone to the human quarters, and knelt as if in prayer, and let the drone slip from her sleeve into the recycler chute, and the recycler chute vented, as recycler chutes do, and somewhere in that vented cloud of waste, a thing, the size of a fingernail, had drifted free and fallen dark and cold toward the coordinates burned into its tiny mind, carrying 7 worlds worth of murder in its belly, out toward a ship that could not be seen. He showed her all of it because he could not imagine her seeing it. That was the flaw in the Concord, the flaw that ran all the way down to the bottom of them, the flaw that Kesh had taught humanity to hunt. They believed that to be unseen was to be nothing. They had built their entire civilization on the certainty that what mattered was what stood in the light and declared itself. And so they had never, in 4,000 years, learned to be afraid of the dark. Alish Varro intended to teach them. "You will attend the assembly," Tavan Rel told her on the 14th hour as an aide fitted him into the heavier ceremonial rig of the flag rank. There was a new energy in him now, a barely contained brightness, and Alish understood that the muster was near its end. "It is a courtesy. Your delegation should see it. I think it will be instructive." An assembly sub-marshal. A departure, he smiled, and for the first time it was not entirely contempt. There was joy in it, the pure clean joy of a man about to do the thing he was made for. "The fleet stands ready. In a few hours we move to the frontier to resolve the difficulties along your border, permanently." He fastened the last clasp himself, and the gold caught the light and threw it back, the way everything the Conquered touched threw light back, and he looked at her the way a bright thing looks at a gray one. "I wanted you to see it, Commander, all of it, so that when you return to your people you can tell them what you witnessed, so that they understand the choice before them with their own eyes." He spread his long hands. "That is the mercy we offer, you see. We let you see us coming." Alish Varro looked up at him, and she made herself small, and she kept her face still, and inside the stillness something very old and very cold turned over once, like a sleeper waking. "Thank you, Sub-Marshal," she said. "I'll be sure they understand exactly what I saw." On the Sable Iris, the department heads had assembled, and the war they were planning was a very small and very quiet war compared to the one gathering in the light 4 light seconds away. They met in the ready room aft of the bridge, a compartment barely large enough to hold them, and they met in the same deep red glow that ruled the whole ship, and they spoke in the same low voices, because on the Iris there was no such thing as a place where discipline stopped. Surabel stood at the head of the table with the commander's intelligence spread across it in light, and around her stood the people who would turn that intelligence into consequence. There was Daishi Okonkwo, who ran the sensors and the stealth management, and who had not slept a full night since the mission began. Because the thing that kept the iris invisible was not a machine you could set and forget, but a living argument the ship had to win against the universe every second of every day, and Daishi was the man who won it. There was Master Gunner Priya Anand, who commanded the emitter arrays that studded the iris's ugly hull, and who spoke of the ship's weapons the way a surgeon speaks of a scalpel, which is to say with respect and without romance. There was Chief Engineer Boone, a broad, silent man who kept the reactors fed and the heat sinks cold, and who had once, during the ship's trials, held a coolant breech shut with his own gauntleted hands for 90 seconds while a repair crew fought toward him, and who never spoke of it, and whom everyone on the ship would have followed into a star. And there was Surabel, who held them all together, and who was about to ask them to do something no human ship had ever done. 7 worlds, she said, and let the number sit there. That's the target list. Talat frontier colonies, Meru, Vashti, the Akan cluster, the rest. Total population, our best estimate, 40 million. The Concord means to render them in sequence, the way they did Kesh, and they mean to do it inside the next 90 hours. She looked around the table. Our orders, the orders we deployed under, were reconnaissance and confirmation. Confirm the massing. Confirm the intent. Get the commander back out and carry the warning home so the frontier could be evacuated. She paused. The commander's red changes that. Changes it how? Said Priya Anand, though she already knew, because she had been running the geometry in her head since the drone came in. There's no time to evacuate 7 worlds, Sura said. There was never going to be. 40 million people on colonies with a handful of transports each. Even if we ran home right now and screamed it from the rooftops, we'd get a fraction off before the Concord arrives, and the Concord would render the rest for the insult. That was always the trap in the reconnaissance plan. We were sent to bring back a warning we couldn't act on in time. A muscle moved in her jaw. So we're not going to bring back a warning. We're going to make the war not happen. Chief Boone spoke, which he rarely did. 1 ship. 1 ship, Sura agreed. In the exact wrong place at the exact wrong time, holding the exact card the Concord doesn't know exists. She keyed the display, and the light rearranged itself into the meridian yards, and the muster fleet and the one small gray marker that was the iris. Here's what the commander bought us. The Concord's entire theater command is aboard the Orlith. Rel, his staff. The rendering doctrine lives in his head and in that ship's cores. And the Orlith is going to do something in the next few hours that the Concord considers so safe that they've built 400 years of tactical doctrine on its safety. She looked up. They're going to muster in the open, in full view, lights blazing. Because in their entire history, no enemy has ever been able to reach a Concord fleet at its own muster. Being seen is their armor. Being seen is the whole philosophy. They cannot conceive of a threat that they cannot see coming. Daishi Okonkwo let out a slow breath, and we're the threat they can't see coming. We are the threat they cannot conceive of, Sura said. There is a difference, and it is the difference that keeps us alive. Daishi, walk me through it. Cold. Daishi stood and took the display, and the geometry of the thing bloomed under his hands, and the crew watched their deaths and their victory take shape in the same red light. The muster works like this, he said. The fleet forms up on the Orlith. Flag first, then the line, then the auxiliaries in a sphere about the flagship. It's a formation, it's ceremonial, it's 4,000 years old. For about 40 minutes during formation, every ship in the fleet drops its screens and runs its lights full for the muster scan. It's how the flag confirms the fleet's ready. 40 minutes where the whole force is lit up and soft. They do it because nothing can touch them during it. Nothing ever has. He moved the marker. We're 4 light seconds out, dark, cold, 31% thermal. If we move now slow on the quiet drive, we can be inside 200 kilometers of the Orlith by the time the muster forms. Point blank. Their point defense is calibrated to engage threats at 10,000 kilometers and out, because that's where a threat is supposed to declare itself. They have never once, in the history of the Concord, needed to shoot at something 200 kilometers away that they couldn't see. And when we fire, Priya said softly, we're not invisible anymore. No, Daishi's face was grim. The moment we run the emitters hot, we light up like a sun. Everything we've been hoarding, the whole thermal debt, the drive signature, all of it, it comes off us at once. We decloak whether we mean to or not. You cannot fire a main lance and stay a ghost. For about 4 seconds after we open fire, we are the loudest, brightest, most visible object in this entire volume of space. He looked at Sura. 4 seconds. That's what we get. 4 seconds where they see us and understand and cannot yet respond. After that, they will bring the entire muster fleet's fire down on our position, and we will not survive it. So whatever we do in those 4 seconds has to end the war. Silence in the red room. Priya, Sura said, can it be done in 4 seconds from 200 kilometers against the Orolith? Priya Anand had been waiting for the question, and she answered it with the flat certainty of someone who had already done the arithmetic 3 times. The Orolith runs her screens down for the muster, same as the rest. For those 40 minutes she soft mirror-alloy hull, no field, trusting the fleet around her and the 4,000 years behind her. She met Sura's eyes. At 200 kilometers with the arrays we're carrying against an unshielded capital hull, yes, Captain, 4 seconds is enough. It's more than enough. We won't just hurt her. We'll take her apart. Flag, staff, cores, doctrine, all of it in one pass before the fleet knows what killed it. And the fleet will be leaderless, blind, and terrified, Priya said. For the first time in 4,000 years, the Concord will have been struck from the dark by something it swore could not exist. They came here to teach the frontier a lesson about who holds the light. A thin, terrible smile crossed her face. We're going to teach them a different one. Sura Bell looked around the table one last time. At these people she had lived beside in the dark for the length of the mission, and she thought of Kesh, and she thought of the light over Kesh, and she thought of the 40 million on the frontier who did not know that 7 suns were being aimed at their sky. We came here to watch, she said. That was the mission. Watch, confirm, carry the warning home. She straightened. But the commander is still aboard that flagship. She has to be back with us before we fire, because the instant we fire, everyone in a diplomatic uniform aboard the Orolith is dead. So here is the plan. We wait. We hold. We let the muster form. And the moment the commander is off that ship, the moment she is back aboard the Iris, we close and we decloak, and we do to the Orolith what the Concord has spent 4,000 years doing to everyone weaker than themselves. She let the words fall. In the dark, where they never learned to look. The extraction of Commander Elish Varro from the flagship of the Bright Meridian was, on paper, the simplest part of the plan, and everyone involved understood that it was therefore the part most likely to kill her. The cover was a diplomatic withdrawal. The delegation had been shown the muster. The muster was the Concord's grand gesture, the mercy of letting the enemy see the fist before it fell. And now the delegation would depart, as delegations do, to carry home the terrible knowledge of what they had witnessed. It was expected. Tavan Rel had all but scripted it himself. The human shuttles would undock during the muster's formation window, when the flagship's attention was on the assembling fleet, and not on 3 small vessels of no consequence slipping away toward the frontier. From the Concord's point of view, it was a courtesy extended to the defeated. From humanity's point of view, it was the only window in which Elish Varro could get clear of the blast radius of her own attack. She stood in the delegation's departure bay, and she made herself small one last time. You are certain you will not stay for the departure salute, Tavan Rel said. He had come to see her off personally, which was an honor and which was also a nuisance, because his presence meant she could not yet let her face go still and cold, could not yet stop being the overmatched young diplomat and start being the thing she was. It is a considerable sight, Commander. 200 vessels lighting their drives in sequence. There are those who travel a great distance simply to witness a Concord muster. I don't doubt it, Sub-Marshal. She kept her eyes down, deferential, small. But my people will want the report as quickly as I can bring it, you understand. There's a great deal to consider. There is. And he softened again, in that way he had the largeness of the strong toward the weak. Commander, I will tell you something as one soldier to another, though you serve a lesser flag. He crouched, bringing his long face down to her level, and there was something almost kind in it, and that was the worst part, that he could believe himself kind while 40 million people slept under 7 suns he was about to unmake. The choice your people face is a hard one. I know that. But it is a real choice, and that is more than most receive from us. Go home, tell them what you saw. Tell them that the Concord fights in the light, and that the light is coming, and that they may yet choose to stand aside and live rather than shine briefly and die. He straightened. That is a mercy your ugly little ships would never extend to us, I think. No, Elish said quietly, it isn't. She meant it, and he took it for agreement, and he did not hear the other thing in it, which was true, which was the truest thing she had said in 19 hours. Humanity would not extend that mercy. Humanity had learned at Kesh exactly what the Concord's mercy was worth, and it had gone home and built a different kind of ship, and the different kind of ship did not warn you. It did not let you see it coming. It did not give you the dignity of watching what ended you. It simply arrived. Out of the dark you had never learned to fear, and it was already too late by the time you knew it was there. That was the mercy humanity had learned to give. It was over quickly. The shuttle undocked on schedule. Elish sat in the passenger cradle beside her handful of real diplomats. Good people, terrified people, people who had spent 19 hours smiling at monsters and now sat rigid and pale as the shuttle drifted clear of the flagship's hull. And she watched, through the small forward port, the Concord fleet begin to form up around the Orlith. It was, she would admit to no one, beautiful. 200 warships, each one a moving city of light, sliding into the ancient formation sphere with a grace that 4,000 years of practice had polished to something like art. Running lights strung like festival lanterns, mirror holes throwing back the glare of the distant sun. The Orlith at the center, largest and brightest of all, her screens dropping for the muster scan, her hull naked and gleaming and utterly, serenely certain that nothing in the universe could reach her. Elish thought of the light over Kesh, which she had never seen, and which every human of her age had grown up inside the shadow of anyway. She thought of the 40 million. She thought of Taven Rel crouching to bring his kind and contemptuous face down to her level. Then she keyed the cold protocol transmitter woven into the shuttle's frame, and she sent a single burst, tight and dark, toward a patch of empty space 4 light seconds away where the stars were subtly, invisibly wrong. The burst said, "Clear, begin." On the sable iris, Daishi Okonkwo saw the burst arrive, and read it, and spoke the 2 words the whole ship had been holding its breath for. "She's clear." Surabel was already in the command chair. She had been in it for 2 hours, and she would not leave it again until this was finished, one way or the other. "Confirm the shuttle's outbound vector. I want daylight between the commander and the target before we so much as twitch." "Confirmed." Shuttles running for the frontier corridor, full civilian drive, no stealth. They're a diplomatic vessel departing under flag, exactly what the Concord expects to see. In 90 seconds they'll be past our firing line and clear of the projected debris cone. Daishi's hands moved across his board with the economy of a man who had rehearsed this 10,000 times in the dark of his own skull. The Concord's tracking the shuttle. Good. It means they're looking outward, at the thing that's supposed to be leaving. Not inward, at the thing that isn't supposed to be here. "Chief Boone, thermal state." Boone's voice came up from engineering, flat and calm. 44%, Captain, and climbing. We've been dark a long time. The sinks are getting full. I can hold silent for maybe another 6 hours before we have to surface and shed, but past 60%, the reactors start to labor and our signature creeps up. A pause. "If we're going to do this, Captain, sooner is a great deal better than later." "Understood, Priya." "Array's cold and ready, Captain." Priya Anand's voice was steady as a held note. "Firing solution locked on the Orlith and updating every half-second off Daishi's passive track. At 200 kilometers, I don't need to think about her screens because she won't have any. I need 4 seconds and a clear line." "Give me both, and I'll give you the Concord's theater command as a debris field." Surabel looked at the great shining formation on her display. The muster nearly complete now. The sphere of light almost closed. The Orlith blazing at its heart in the full serene glory of a power that had never once been made afraid. And she felt the last of her doubt go out of her like a tide. "Helm," she said, "ahead 1/3 on the quiet drive, take us in. 200 kilometers off the flagship's flank into her blind cone and hold." She settled back. "Nice and slow, nice and cold. Let's go pay a visit to people who never learned to lock their doors." The sable iris, 400 meters of ugly gray silence, began to move. There is a particular quality to the last hour before a thing that cannot be undone, and everyone aboard the sable iris felt it, and no one spoke of it, because there was nothing to say that the discipline of the ship had not already said for them. The iris crept inward across the 4 light seconds at a fraction of the speed she was capable of, because speed was heat and heat was death, and every kilometer she gained toward the shining fleet was a kilometer bought with patience. Daishi Okonkwo did not leave his board. He could not. The thing that kept them invisible was not automatic in these final approaches. When the geometry between the iris and the enemy's sensors shifted second by second, and the ship's skin had to be told, constantly, precisely, what emptiness to counterfeit. A single miscalculation, a photon reflected wrong, a heat bloom vented in error, a gravitic ripple traced across the metric, and the Concord would see them, and the 4 seconds humanity had spent a generation earning would be spent on nothing. So Daishi did not blink more than he had to, and he watched the numbers, and he made the iris a hole in the universe, again and again, 10 times a second, all the long way in. Elish Varro's shuttle was gone from the tactical plot now, a bright civilian mote fleeing dutifully toward the frontier, exactly as the Concord expected a beaten delegation to flee. She had done her part. She had walked into the brightest place in the galaxy and come out with its secrets, and now she rode a slow shuttle away from the thing she had set in motion, and Surabel did not envy her that ride. It was one thing to fight in the dark. It was another to have lit the fuse and then be forced to watch from a distance while other hands did the killing. "Range 1,000 kilometers, Daishi said. "Musters fully formed. All 200 vessels are lit and soft for the scan. The Orlith screens are down." He swallowed. "It's happening exactly like the doctrine says. They're doing the thing they've always done, Captain, the thing that's always kept them safe. It's almost hard to watch. They have no idea." "That's the point," Sura said quietly. "That's what 4,000 years without a single loss does to a people. It makes them certain. Certainty is the softest armor there is." She leaned toward her own display. "Keep taking us in. What's the fleet doing?" Mation salute. The lead elements are cycling their drives, that sequential light show the sub-marshal wanted the commander to stay for. It's ceremonial. The whole force will run the salute, then the flag gives the order and they translate out toward the frontier as one. Daishi's jaw tight. "That's our clock, Captain. Once the salute finishes, they go. Maybe 40 minutes. If we're going to fire on the flag while she's soft, it has to be before the fleet forms up for the jump and she raises her screens again." 40 minutes, Surabel nodded slowly. "Priya." "Time to firing position." At this crawl, 31 minutes to 200 kilometers. Priya's voice never wavered, but there was a new tautness in it now, the tautness of a bowstring drawn most of the way back. "That's cutting the window thin, Captain. If anything slows us, a course adjustment, a sensor sweep we have to dodge, we lose the shot." She raises her screens for the jump, and then 4 seconds isn't enough anymore. 4 minutes wouldn't be enough. We only get her while she's soft." "Then nothing slows us," Sura said. "Helm, hold your crawl. Daishi, your only job in this universe is to make sure no sweep touches us." Boone. 51%, Captain, Chief Boone said before she could ask. "Climbing a little faster than I'd like. The closer we get to the fleet, the more of their radiated heat we have to counterfeit around, and it's costing us. We're still inside tolerance. But I'll be honest with you, I want this over." "We all do, Chief." Surabel looked at the shining sphere of the conquered fleet, huge now on her display, close enough that she could pick out individual vessels, the long, elegant Vashani-class dreadnoughts and the slim couriers and the auxiliaries, all of them blazing, all of them soft, all of them certain. "We all do." And they crept on into the light unseen. Aboard the Orlith, Submarshal Tavan Rel stood on the flag bridge and watched his fleet salute him. And he was, for the first time in a long career, purely and simply happy. He was not a cruel man. He would have been genuinely offended by the suggestion. He had never in his life killed for pleasure, never rendered a world out of malice, never done anything but his duty as the conquered defined it, which was to bring the light of order to the dark and disordered places of the galaxy, and to do so honestly, in the open, giving even the enemy the dignity of foreknowledge. He believed all of this. He believed it the way a man believes in the ground under his feet, without ever once having to think about it. And so when he looked out at his fleet, 200 ships, 40,000 crew, the mailed fist of the Bright Meridian gathered to resolve a frontier problem that had festered too long, he felt no guilt at all. He felt only the clean satisfaction of a job about to be done well. The frontier would be resolved. The 7 worlds along the Talat marches had refused the conquered's authority. They had sheltered the ugly gray ships of the human fleet. They had leaned on the fence, as the humans put it, and the fence would now lean back decisively in the honest, bright manner of his people. The worlds would be given the choice, as Kesh had been given the choice: submit or be rendered in full view of all. Most would submit, some would not. Those that did not would light the sky, and travelers would come from far systems to witness it, and the lesson would be written in fire where everyone could read it, and the frontier would be quiet for another generation. It was, Tavan Rel thought, a good and necessary thing, and he was proud to be the hand that did it. He thought briefly of the human commander, Varro, a strange young woman sharp behind the deference. He'd sensed that much, but ultimately just what she appeared to be, an envoy of a poor and clever people who had come to see whether the fence would hold and been shown that it would. She had taken the lesson well, he thought. She had not argued. She had conceded that her ships were ugly, conceded that her people could not afford beauty, and there had been something almost dignified in the concession, the dignity of a small thing that knows it is small. He hoped she would carry the warning home clearly. He hoped her people would choose to stand aside. He did not want to render the frontier if the frontier could be persuaded to live. That too he believed of himself, and it was even true. Submarshal, his flag captain at his elbow, the salute is 3/4 complete. The rearguard elements are cycling now. On your order, the fleet will form for translation. Let them finish, Tavan said. Let them have their moment. It's a long road to the frontier and a hard duty at the end of it. Let the fleet salute itself first. He clasped his long hands behind his back and watched the drive cycle down the formation in a rolling wave of light, ship after ship flaring bright and settling, a chain of small suns lighting and dimming across the dark. It was the most beautiful thing his people made. It was the thing that separated them from the beasts, this insistence on doing even their killing in the open in glory where it could be seen and judged and remembered. You know, he said, half to himself, there are peoples in this galaxy who fight from concealment, who strike in the dark and slink away, cowards, thieves. He shook his head. I have always pitied them. To be so afraid of the light that you hide from it your whole life. What a small way to exist. Yes, Submarshal. We are not afraid of anything, Tavan Rel said, with the serene certainty of 4,000 unbroken years. That is the whole of it in the end. We have never had reason to be. And a people who have never been afraid, he smiled at his shining fleet, are free in a way the frightened can never understand. Behind him, on the great flag display, the salute rolled on toward its end, and no instrument aboard the Orlith showed the gray shape crawling toward her through the dark, 200 kilometers off her naked flank, because no instrument aboard the Orlith had ever been built to look for such a thing, because in 4,000 years there had never been such a thing to find. 250 kilometers, Daisy Okonkwo breathed. 240, 230. We're inside their point defense envelope, Captain. We're inside the range they don't watch. We're God, we're right on top of her. We're right underneath her keel. The Orlith filled the tactical display now, no longer an icon but a shape, a vast gleaming mountain of mirror alloy hanging soft and screenless in the dark, close enough that the iris's passive sensors could count the seams in her hull plating, could see the running lights strung along her spine, could resolve the tiny bright specks that were viewports with people behind them. 900 meters of flagship, the beating heart of the Bright Meridian's war on the frontier. And around her the whole shining sphere of the fleet, oblivious, saluting, certain. Surabel looked at it, and for one long moment she let herself feel the full weight of what she was about to do, because a commander who does not feel that weight is a commander who should never be given the shot. 40,000 people crewed that fleet. She was not going to kill 40,000 people. The plan did not require it, and her conscience would not permit it. She was going to kill one ship, and the command that lived aboard it, and the doctrine that lived in its cores, and in doing so she was going to make the murder of 40 million impossible. That was the arithmetic. She had checked it and checked it again, and it held. But she would still be the one who gave the order, and she would remember it the way Surabel remembered the light over Kesh. That was the price of fighting in the dark. You did not get to feel clean afterward. You only got to be the reason 40 million people woke up the next morning without knowing how close the sky had come to falling. Priya, she said, 200 kilometers, hold us here, firing solution. Locked, Captain. Priya Annan's voice was a held breath. Full array, focused pass, targeting the flag's command spine and reactor spaces. At this range against an unshielded hull, the discharge doesn't spread, it goes straight through her, stem to stern. 4 seconds of full emission and there won't be a flag bridge, a staff, or a core left aboard that ship. She'll break in half before the fleet's sensors finish telling them what happened. A pause. But when I fire, Captain, we light up. Everything we've been holding comes off at once. 51% thermal debt, the full drive signature, the array bloom, all of it in an instant. We go from a hole in the universe to the brightest object in it. There's no way to fire and stay dark. The moment I pull, they see us. They see exactly what we are. I know, Sura said softly. After that it's 4 seconds, Priya said. 4 seconds where they see us and can't answer. Then the whole fleet's fire comes down on this position. And no stealth in the universe saves us, because you can't hide from someone who already knows exactly where you are. I know that too. Surabel looked one last time at the shining, certain, oblivious enemy, and she thought of Tavanrel crouching to bring his kind face down to a young woman's level, offering her the mercy of watching what would end her people. She thought of 40 million on the frontier. She thought of the light over Kesh, which she had watched as a girl, which she had carried folded up small inside her chest for 30 years, taken out only when it was useful. It was useful now. They spent 4,000 years teaching the galaxy to fear the light, Surabel said. Let's teach them the dark. She drew a breath. Chief Boone, all reactors to the arrays on my mark. Daishi, log everything. I want the galaxy to see exactly what happened here. Priya. Her voice did not shake. You are cleared to fire, decloak on discharge, all power. Aye, Captain. Fire. And the sable iris, 400 meters of ugly gray silence that the Concord of the Bright Meridian swore could not exist, opened her arrays 200 kilometers off the flank of the enemy flagship, and stopped being a ghost. On the flag bridge of the Orlith, The first thing anyone noticed was not the weapon. It was the ship. For 4,000 years, the sensor officers of the Concord fleet had been trained to watch the far dark, 10,000 kilometers and beyond, the honorable distance at which an enemy declared itself and gave battle. No one had ever taught them to watch the near dark, the 200 kilometers off a flagship's flank where nothing had ever been, because nothing could ever be there. So when the sable iris shed her invisibility all at once, when every photon she had been swallowing and every jewel she had been hoarding, and the whole vast thermal debt of the mission came off her hull in a single searing instant, the effect on the Concord's instruments was not the quiet ping of a distant contact. It was a scream. An alert officer, a young woman not so different in age from Alish Varro, was the first to see it, and for a full second she simply did not understand what her board was telling her. There was a ship. There was a ship 200 kilometers off the flag's port flank. It had not translated in. The drive signature was wrong, cold, and strange, a signature the Concord's libraries classified as a theoretical impossibility. It had not approached across the watch distances. There was no track, no history, no record of it crossing the 10,000 kilometers where an enemy was supposed to appear. It was simply there, close enough to touch, a gray wedge with no lights and no reflection and no name, and it had been there, her board was now telling her in a cascade of retroactive horror, for some time. Minutes. It had crawled in under the keel of the flagship of the Bright Meridian while the whole fleet saluted itself in glory, and it had done it in the dark, and no one had seen. "Contact," she screamed, and it came out wrong, too high, cracking on the word, because there was no protocol for this, no drill, no calm procedural phrase for the arrival of the inconceivable. "Contact 200 kilometers port flank close aboard. It's sub-marshal, there's a ship. It's right on top of us." Tavanrell turned from his shining fleet, and he did not yet feel fear, because a man who has never in his life had reason to be afraid does not have the reflex ready. What he felt, in the first quarter-second, was confusion. 200 kilometers was not a distance at which enemies existed. It was inside the fleet's own formation, inside the point defense minimum, inside the space that was by definition safe. His mind reached for an explanation, a malfunction, a sensor ghost, an auxiliary out of position, and found none. And in the reaching he turned to look at the flag display, and he saw it. He saw the ship. It was ugly. That was his first coherent thought, and it would be in a sense his last, that the thing was ugly, gray and matte and windowless, a poor man's welded wedge, the exact ship the human commander had described to him with such strange candor. We don't build for beauty. We stopped a long time ago, because we learned what happens to things that shine. He had thought it was philosophy. He had thought it was the sad wisdom of a small people making excuses for their poverty. He understood now, in the half-second he had left to understand anything, that it had not been philosophy at all. It had been a description. She had told him exactly what her people had become, and exactly what was about to happen to him, and he had heard it as the humility of the weak, because he could not conceive of any other way to hear it. "Screens," Tavanrell said. His voice was very quiet. "Raise the—" He never finished the order, and it would not have mattered if he had, because the Orlith screens took 11 seconds to raise from cold, and the human ship had given the universe 4. The sable iris fired. At 200 kilometers, against a hull with no field to stop it, the discharge of the iris's full array did not spread and did not soften and did not, in any sense that the Concord's honorable doctrine would have recognized, give the enemy the dignity of a fair contest. It was not a duel. It was an execution carried out in the dark, on a target that never saw it coming, and it was over almost before it began. A lance of focused annihilation crossed the 200 kilometers in the time it takes a heart to begin a single beat, and it struck the mirror-bright flank of the Orlith, and it did not stop at the hull. It went through. It went through the outer plating, and the crew decks, and the long armored spine where the command systems lived. through the flag bridge where Tavanrel stood with an unfinished order on his lips, through the staff spaces where the theater command bent over their luminous tables, through the cores where the rendering doctrine for 7 worlds sat waiting to be carried to the frontier. It went through the reactor spaces, and there it found something to feed on, and the flagship of the Bright Meridian, 900 meters of glory and certainty and 4,000 unbroken years, came apart from the inside in a single expanding sphere of light. It was, Surabel would think later when she let herself think about it at all, a terrible irony. The Concord had wanted to fight in the light. In the end they got their wish. For one instant the Orlith blazed brighter than any ship in the fleet, brighter than the Salute, brighter than the sun the yards orbited, a new star, born and dying in the same second, casting the shadows of 200 saluting warships long and sharp across the dark. The Concord had always said they gave their enemies the dignity of seeing what ended them. Humanity had learned a different courtesy. The 40,000 crew of the fleet would see, in that light, exactly what had ended their flagship. But the flagship itself, and the command that lived in it, and the man who had crouched to offer a young woman his kind and contemptuous mercy, they never saw it at all. It was over that quickly. That was the mercy humanity had learned to give. 4 seconds. Cease fire, Surabel said, and Priya Anand cut the arrays, and the sable iris, no longer a ghost, no longer anything but a small, ugly ship lit up like a beacon 200 kilometers inside the enemy's formation, hung in the sudden dark after the star had died, and waited to see whether she would live. The conquered fleet did not respond for a long time. It was not a long time by any objective measure, perhaps 9 seconds, 10, but aboard the Iris it stretched into something close to eternity, and every soul on the ship spent it certain that the next instant would bring 200 warships worth of fire down on their heads. That was the plan's grim arithmetic. 4 seconds to kill the flag, and then the reckoning. Priya Anand's hands were already moving to bring the arrays back to a firing state, though she knew, they all knew, that against the whole fleet at once the Iris's arrays were a knife against an avalanche. Daishi Okonkwo was already screaming the ship back toward the dark, dumping the drive into an emergency evasion, trying to re-establish even a fraction of the stealth that firing had stripped away, knowing it was hopeless, knowing that you cannot hide from an enemy who already has your exact position burned into 200 targeting solutions. But the fire did not come, because the conquered fleet in that moment was not an avalanche. It was 200 ships that had just watched their flagship, their command, their doctrine, their 4,000-year certainty die in a single instant, killed from a direction and a distance, and by a thing that their entire understanding of the universe insisted could not exist. There was no admiral to give the order. The admiral was a debris field. There was no theater staff to coordinate a response. The staff had died with the flag. There was no doctrine for this, because doctrine is written by people who have imagined the thing that might happen, and no one in the Concord of the Bright Meridian had ever once, in 4,000 years, imagined this. The fleet did not counterattack because the fleet did not know how. For 9 seconds, 10, the mailed fist of the Bright Meridian simply hung in the dark, leaderless and blind, and, for the first time in its long and glorious history, afraid. And in those 9 seconds, the thing that humanity had truly come to do began. Because the killing of the flagship was never the whole of the plan. The flagship was the instrument. The real target was the certainty, the 4,000-year conviction that being seen was armor, that the light was safe, that the dark held nothing to fear. Surabel had understood this from the beginning, and Alish Varro had understood it, and it was the reason the Iris's log had been recording every instant of the operation in merciless detail, and it was the reason that, in the long silent seconds after the Orlith died, Daishi Okonkwo did not only run. "Captain," he said, his voice ragged, "Evasion's live, we're running dark as we can, but they'll find us the second anyone thinks to look. Orders." "Transmit," Surabel said. Daisy blinked. Captain. The log, the whole log, everything. Broadband, unencrypted, every language the Concord speaks and a dozen they don't. Send it to the fleet. Send it to the yards. Send it to every ship, every station, every listening post in this system. Her voice was iron. I want every soul in the Bright Meridian to see exactly what happened here. I want them to see the ship they couldn't see. I want them to see how close we were and how long we were there and how easily it was done. I want them to understand from this second forward that the dark is not empty, that we are in it, that we have always been in it and they never knew. She leaned forward. They wanted to fight in the light so the galaxy could witness their power. Fine. Let the galaxy witness this. Transmit, Lieutenant Commander, now. Daisy transmitted. The log went out across the Meridian system at the speed of light. The passive track of the iris crawling in under the flagship's keel, the 200 kilometers of dark approach, the 4 seconds of fire, the death of the orolith rendered in the iris's own merciless sensor truth. It went to 200 warships still hanging stunned in their broken formation. It went to the shipyards, to the half-built dreadnoughts, to the muster hall and the reception rooms and the great luminous tables where the theater staff had bent over the murder of 7 worlds. And everywhere it arrived, it carried the same message, and the message was not in words, because it did not need to be. The message was, we were here, you did not see us. We could have been anywhere, we could be anywhere now. And the Concord of the Bright Meridian, 4,000 years without fear, learned fear all at once, in a single system, in a single hour, from a single ugly ship that they had sworn could not exist. The fleet came apart. Not in fire, in panic, which for people who had never known it was worse than fire. Ships that had held formation discipline for 4,000 years broke their stations and scattered, each captain suddenly, viscerally aware that the dark around them was no longer empty, that the honorable 10,000-kilometer distance meant nothing, that death could be crawling under their own keel at this very instant, unseen, patient, 200 kilometers away and closing. The muster scan, the salute, the whole ceremonial machinery of a Concord departure collapsed into a frantic scramble as 200 captains simultaneously raised screens they should never have needed at a muster, and fired point defense into empty space at shadows that weren't there, and screamed for orders from a flag that no longer existed. Priya Anand watched it on the tactical display with something that was not quite satisfaction and not quite horror. They're shooting at nothing, she said quietly. They're shooting at each other's shadows. Captain, they've completely lost cohesion. There's no fleet there anymore. There's just 200 terrified ships in a volume of space that they suddenly can't trust. Then we did it, Daisy said, and there was disbelief in it, the disbelief of a man who had rehearsed his own death 10,000 times and was still somehow alive. Captain, they haven't found us. They're too busy panicking to run a coherent search. Our evasions holding were back down to maybe 40% stealth and dropping into their sensor clutter, and every second they spend screaming is a second we get further into the dark. I think, Captain, I think we're going to make it out. Surabel did not answer at once. She watched the great shining fleet of the Bright Meridian dissolve into fear on her display, and she thought about the 40 million on the frontier who would wake tomorrow not knowing, and about the 7 worlds that would not light the sky, and about the 2 million at Kesh who had, 30 years ago, and about the girl she had been in a refugee column with her mother's hand crushing hers, watching the light. Take us home, Daisy, she said at last. Slow and cold and dark the way we came. Rendezvous with the commander's shuttle at the frontier corridor and escort her home. And when we're clear of the system, her voice caught just slightly, just once, and then steadied, log the time. So we remember the hour the galaxy learned that humanity fights in the dark. The sable iris turned her ugly gray flank to the panicking fleet, and began, unseen, to leave. There was a story the human fleet told in the quiet hours about how the sable iris had come to be, and it was not a story of clever engineers or bold admirals, though there had been both. It was a story about a girl and a light, and everyone who served aboard a gray ship knew it, and it was the reason they could hold their faces still in bright places and swallow the contempt of taller peoples without flinching. Sura Bell had lived it. But it belonged now to all of them, the way a scar belongs to the whole body. 30 years before the Orlith died, humanity had built ships that shone. That was the thing the Concord had never bothered to learn in all its contempt, that humanity had not always fought from the dark. Once, human warships had thrown back the light of suns exactly as the Concords did. Once, humanity had gone out to meet the galaxy on the galaxy's terms, in glory declaring itself, certain in the way that the young and the untested are certain. Humanity had built a fleet to be proud of, mirror bright and blazing, and it had taken that fleet to Kesh when the Concord came, and it had stood in the honest light and given battle, and the Concord had unmade it as thoroughly and as beautifully as they unmade the cities below. 2 million dead on the ground, a proud fleet dead in the sky, and a girl in a refugee column, watching the light, learning the lesson that would remake her whole species. You could not win in the light, not against them, not by their rules on their ground in the bright honest places where 4,000 years of practice made them invincible. Humanity had tried, and humanity had burned, and humanity had gone home carrying its dead and thought, harder than it had ever thought about anything, about what was left when you could not win the fight your enemy wanted. What was left was the fight your enemy could not imagine. The Iris and her ugly gray sisters had been born in that thinking. Every choice that made them hideous was a choice paid for in the fire over Kesh. They did not reflect, because reflection was how the Concord found you. They vented no heat, because heat was how the Concord tracked you. They carried no lights, no names in glorious script, no beauty of any kind, because beauty was a thing that declared itself, and a thing that declared itself was a thing that died. Humanity had taken everything the Concord was proud of and inverted it, one hard lesson at a time, until it had built a fleet that was the exact photographic negative of glory. And then it had waited, patient and silent and unseen, for the Concord to lean on the fence one season too many. Elish Varro had grown up on that story. Her generation had been raised inside the shadow of a light they had never seen, taught from childhood that the galaxy was a place where the strong blazed and the wise hid, and that survival was not a glory to be won, but a discipline to be kept. She had learned to hold her face still before she had learned to hold a weapon. She had gone into the schools the fleet ran for people who would walk into bright places and pretend to be small, and she had been good at it, better than good, because she carried the same folded-up cold thing in her chest that Sura Bell carried, that every human of the age carried, taken out only when it was useful. It had been useful on the Orlith. It had been useful when Taven Rel crouched to bring his kind and contemptuous face down to her level, and offered her the mercy of watching what would end her people. She had held her face still. She had made herself small. She had let him show her everything, because he could not conceive of her seeing it, and she had walked out of the brightest place in the galaxy with its death copied into a crystal behind her sternum. That was the story the fleet told. It was not a story about revenge, though there was revenge in it. It was a story about learning, about a people who had been shown in fire that they could not win the fight the galaxy demanded, and who had refused to lose, and who had gone away and found a fight the galaxy could not even see. The Concord called it cowardice. The Concord called it the small way to exist, the way of thieves and cowards who feared the light. And the Concord was wrong, in the way that only the very powerful and the very certain can be wrong completely, serenely, and fatally. Humanity did not fear the light. Humanity had simply stood in it once, at Kesh, and watched 2 million people and a proud, bright fleet die in its glory, and drawn the only conclusion a species that intends to survive can draw. The light is where you go to be seen, and to be seen against an enemy like the Concord is to be already dead. So they had learned the dark, not because they were afraid of it, because they had made it theirs. They had gone into the emptiness the Concord could not imagine an enemy occupying, and they had learned to live there, patient and cold and silent, for as long as it took. They had built ships that were holes in the universe, and crewed them with people who could hold their faces still through anything. And they had waited, one generation, for the arrogance of a people who had never been afraid to bring a flagship soft and screenless to a muster 200 kilometers from a ghost. That was the whole of it in the end. The Concord had spent 4,000 years teaching the galaxy that the light was truth and the dark was cowardice. And humanity had spent 1 generation and 1 hour and 1 ugly gray ship teaching them the thing that all their glory had never let them learn. That the dark was not empty. That it never had been. That it had been full all along of patient and silent and utterly unafraid enemies, learning them, watching them, waiting, and that the only difference between the light and the dark in the end was that the people in the light could be seen coming, and the people in the dark could not. The sub-marshal had wanted Elish Varro to carry a warning home to her people. Tell them what you saw, he had said. Tell them the light is coming. Let them choose to stand aside and live. She had carried a warning in the end, but not the one he meant and not to the people he meant. She had carried it in the merciless truth of a ship's log, broadband and unencrypted, to 200 terrified captains and a broken empire, and a galaxy that had spent 4,000 years learning to fear the wrong thing. And the warning had said, in every language the Concord spoke and a dozen they did not, we are in the dark. We have always been in the dark, and we are not afraid of it at all. The frontier corridor was a long, empty stretch of nothing between the meridian marches and human space, and it was in that emptiness that Commander Elish Varro's shuttle waited, running slow and civilian and afraid, for a ship that no one would be able to see coming. She had watched it happen from a distance, on the shuttle's small passive sensors, and she had watched it in silence, because the diplomats around her, good people, terrified people, people who had smiled at monsters for 19 hours, did not need to hear their commander narrate the death of a flagship. She had seen the Orlith's light bloom and die 4 light seconds behind her, a new star born and gone in a single second, and she had known, in the way you know a thing you have planned for a generation, that Sura Bell had made the shot. She had seen the panic spread across the fleet's formation like a crack across ice. And she had sat very still and let her face go, finally, still and cold and true, and thought of a tall man crouching to bring his kind and contemptuous face down to her level, offering her the mercy of watching what would end her people. That is the mercy we offer, you see. We let you see us coming. No, Elish said aloud, softly to no one, to the empty dark where a gray ship was even now crawling toward her. You didn't. The sable iris found the shuttle 3 hours later, and the shuttle never saw her arrive. One moment the corridor was empty. The next, a tight beam hail came out of the dark on the cold protocol, in Sura Bell's voice, and Elish Varro let out a breath she felt she had been holding for 19 hours and a generation. Commander, Sura's voice said. This is the Iris, we have you. The flag is dead, the doctrine is dead, and the whole of the Bright Meridian just watched a ship they couldn't see take their flagship apart from 200 kilometers. The frontier push is broken. Nobody's going to the Talat marches. Not now, maybe not for a long time. A pause. Welcome back, Commander, come home. Elish closed her eyes. 40 million people on 7 worlds, who would wake tomorrow not knowing how close the sky had come to falling, would go on not knowing, and that was the whole of it. That was the entire victory, that no one on those worlds would ever have to see the light over their cities the way a girl named Sura Bell had once seen the light over Kesh. Copy Iris, she said. Coming home. The consequences of that hour spread outward from the meridian system at the speed of light, and then faster, carried by fleeing couriers and panicked transmissions, and the 1,000 small vessels that had witnessed a conquered muster and seen, instead of glory, the death of a flagship at the hands of a ghost. The Concord tried at first to explain it away. A sabotage, a reactor accident, an internal treachery, anything but the truth, because the truth unmade 4,000 years of certainty in a single stroke, and a people whose entire civilization was built on the safety of the light could not easily admit that the dark had been full of enemies all along. But the Iris's log had gone out broadband and unencrypted, in every language the Concord spoke and a dozen they did not, and it could not be recalled. 200 warships had it in their cores. The shipyards had it. The listening posts had it. And every soul who watched it saw the same thing. A gray ship, ugly and windowless and utterly silent, crawling in under the keel of the mightiest vessel the Bright Meridian had ever built, and lying there unseen for long minutes, and then striking, and then simply being gone. Not destroyed, not driven off. Gone back into the dark, uncaught, unpunished, free. It was that last part that broke them. Not the death of the flagship. Fleets could be rebuilt, ships could be replaced. It was the knowledge that the thing had gotten away. That it was still out there. That the same technology which had put it 200 kilometers off the Orlith's flank could put it 200 kilometers off any flank, at any time, in any system, and no one would ever know until the 4 seconds began. The Concord had spent 4,000 years teaching the galaxy to fear the light of their coming. Now every captain in the fleet lay awake in the honest bright glow of their running lights and understood, for the first time, that the light did not protect them. It only told the dark exactly where to aim. They stopped running their lights at muster within the year. It was the first change. It would not be the last. A civilization does not survive the discovery that its deepest certainty was a lie without changing root and branch, and the Concord of the Bright Meridian was, whatever else could be said of it, a survivor. It changed. It learned to fear the dark. And then, slowly, painfully, humiliatingly, it learned to build ships that lived in it, decades behind the ugly gray fleet that had already been there for a generation. Always behind, always chasing, always aware now that somewhere out in the emptiness there might be a hole in the universe with human eyes behind it, watching. The frontier stayed quiet. The 7 worlds of the Talat marches never learned how close they had come, and that was as it should be. The border incident stopped. The fence, which the Concord had been leaning on so patiently, season after season, was suddenly not a fence they cared to lean on anymore, because a fence you cannot see over is a different kind of fence entirely, and the Concord had discovered, in a single hour, that it could not see over humanity at all. Commander Elish Varro stood on the observation deck of a human station in the deep dark beyond the frontier, and watched the sable Iris come in to dock, and could not see her. That was the thing she loved most in the end. Even here, even at home, even coming into a berth that had been held open for her, the Iris did not blaze. She did not throw back the light. She came in gray and quiet and ugly, drinking her own running lights, a 400-meter hole in the universe, and Elish had to trust the docking telemetry to know she was there at all until the very last moment, when the great matte wedge resolved out of the dark almost close enough to touch. The way she had resolved out of the dark off the Orlith's flank, the way she would resolve, someday, off the flank of anyone foolish enough to believe that being unseen meant being safe. The sub-marshal had called her people's ships ugly. He had been right. Elish had conceded it to his face, and she conceded it now, watching the Iris settle into her berth. They were ugly. They were gray and windowless, and they did not shine, and they had been built that way on purpose, by a people who had stood in a refugee column 30 years ago, and watched a beautiful fleet unmake a world in glory, and had gone home, and thought hard for a generation, and decided that they would never again build a thing that could be seen. He had called it cowardice to fight from the dark. He had pitied the peoples who did it. To be so afraid of the light that you hide from it your whole life, what a small way to exist. And he had died with an unfinished order on his lips, killed by the small frightened thing he pitied, never understanding that it had not been fear at all. Humanity was not afraid of the light. Humanity had simply learned at terrible cost that the light was where you went to die, And that survival, real survival, the kind that let 40 million people wake tomorrow without knowing how close the sky had come, lived in the dark. In patience, in silence, in the willingness to be small and unseen and ugly for as long as it took, and then in 4 seconds to be the last thing an enemy never saw. They had called human tech primitive, gray, ugly, a poor man's welded wedge. They had derided it across a shining gallery on the flagship of the greatest power in the galaxy, and they had been so certain, so serenely and completely certain, that being seen was strength and being unseen was nothing. Then a stealth ship they swore could not exist had decloaked 200 kilometers off their flagship's flank, and taught them, in a single hour, everything their 4,000 years of glory had never bothered to learn. Elishvaro watched the Iris finish her docking, watched the gray hull go still, watched the ship that had unmade the certainty of an empire settle quietly into her berth without a single light to mark her, and she thought that there was a kind of beauty in it after all, not the beauty the Concord meant, the beauty of a thing that blazed and declared itself, but a harder and quieter beauty, the beauty of a thing that had learned exactly what it was and made no apology for it. Let them keep the light, she thought. Let them keep the glory and the running lights and the 4,000 years and all of it. We'll keep the dark, and we'll be there in it, watching, for as long as anyone ever again looks at a human ship and dares to call it primitive. The docking clamps closed with a sound like a held breath finally let go, and somewhere below her a hatch opened, and Sura Bell's crew came home from the dark, and Elishvaro turned from the port to go and meet them, unseen and unafraid, the way her people had learned at last to be.